Statistically, flying is over 100 times safer than driving a car. But when aviation disasters strike, they can claim hundreds of lives, and sometimes the cause is nothing more than a single faulty bolt.
Alaska 261, we are in a dive here.
Can you really get sucked out through a hole in the fuselage like in the movies? Is there any chance of rescue if a plane crashes in the mountains or ocean? And what tiny details lead to deadly aviation catastrophes? On the morning of June 10, 1990, Captain Timothy Lancaster lifted British Airways Flight 5390 into the air. After takeoff, he did what pilots always do, engaged the autopilot and unbuckled his seatbelt. The plane climbed to 17,400 feet when the unthinkable happened. The windscreen in front of the captain suddenly blew out. Within seconds, explosive decompression ripped the cockpit door off its hinges, filled the cabin with fog and swirling wind, and did the most horrifying thing of all. It sucked Lancaster into the gaping hole. But his legs caught on the control panel, and the captain became stuck, pinned by the raging airflow. While panic erupted among passengers, the crew reacted instantly. One flight attendant grabbed the captain around the waist, while another cleared debris from the control panel so co-pilot Alistair Acheson could stabilize the aircraft. But the autopilot had disengaged, and the plane was rapidly losing altitude, diminishing the chances of survival for all 87 people aboard. Though the co-pilot began an emergency descent, he wasn't sure he could land a plane designed to be flown by two people. To make matters worse, the flight attendant holding the captain was quickly becoming exhausted from the fierce wind and freezing temperatures. Another crew member had to take his place. The crew was convinced Captain Lancaster couldn't possibly survive outside the aircraft in those horrific conditions. With crushing pressure in temperatures of 1 degree Fahrenheit, they began to doubt whether they should keep holding on to him. But Acheson absolutely forbade even thinking about letting go, because the body could get sucked into the engine and doom the aircraft to certain disaster. Acheson contacted Southampton Airport and received clearance for an emergency landing. The pilot realized that literally everyone's life depended on him. 22 minutes after the incident, he managed to land the plane safely. Rescue crews arrived immediately. The passengers were terrified, but uninjured, which couldn't be said for the captain. Medics removed Lancaster from the aircraft and checked his pulse to officially pronounce him dead. But incredibly, they discovered the man was alive. Later, he revealed that he had managed to turn his head to breathe, but quickly lost consciousness. Amazingly, Lancaster suffered only frostbite, a broken arm and finger, several cuts and bruises. He underwent treatment and psychological therapy, and returned to flying just 5 months later. The investigation showed the disaster happened because no one had checked the aircraft after a recent windscreen replacement. The engineer who performed it decided to replace the bolts too, but installed ones that were half a millimeter thinner, so the bolts couldn't hold the window in place. The happy ending of Flight 5390 is more the exception than the rule. Flight attendant Michelle Honda and the crew of Aloha Airlines Flight 243 learned this the hard way. By April 28, 1988, their 19-year-old Boeing had logged about 35,000 hours flying between the Hawaiian Islands, completing 90,000 takeoff landing cycles. That April day, the plane passed inspection and completed 3 flights before taking off once more from Hilo to Honolulu with 95 people aboard. The 35-minute flight began normally. First Officer Madeline Tompkins and Captain Robert Schornsteimer controlled the flight, while Michelle Honda and 2 other flight attendants helped passengers. When the Boeing reached 24,000 feet, the cabin suddenly decompressed. Seconds later, the roof tore off above the first 6 rows and ripped away the cockpit door. At that exact moment, flight attendant Clarabelle Lansing was talking to passengers when she was suddenly sucked into the gaping hole before their eyes. Another flight attendant was buried in debris and fell unconscious to the floor, while Michelle Honda suffered a head injury but remained conscious and tried to help passengers. But there was nothing she could do for those who found themselves in the open air at -67 degrees Fahrenheit with wind speeds over 300 miles per hour. For the same reason, she couldn't reach the cockpit to find out if the pilots were alive, since radio contact had been severed. Meanwhile, Madeline Tompkins and Captain Schornsteimer saw sky instead of their aircraft's roof and understood the severity of their situation. Schornsteimer, an Air Force veteran, took control and began a steep descent, while Tompkins contacted air traffic control at Maui Airport. She finally received landing clearance, but accomplishing it would be a true miracle. After decompression, the plane began rocking side to side. Later, it was discovered that it couldn't reduce speed to the required 155 miles per hour. The slower the plane went, the less controllable it became. Meanwhile, Michelle Honda felt the plane slowly descending and decided to secure her colleague's body, which lay at the very edge of the torn fuselage. Honda was convinced the woman was already dead. When the captain reached the airport and prepared to land, indicators showed the front landing gear hadn't deployed. But given the aircraft's horrific damage, they had to land immediately. That wasn't the plane's only problem. He could only reduce speed to 195 miles per hour, which was 46 miles per hour over the limit. Then the Boeing's left engine failed. Schornsteimer didn't know if the passengers were still alive. Saying goodbye to his own life, he aimed the plane at the runway and miraculously managed to land it. This landing is still considered one of aviation's greatest miracles because, by all laws of physics, the plane should have disintegrated in midair. Besides the fuselage and engine, both wings, the tail, and stabilizers were damaged. The greatest miracle was that everyone remaining in the aircraft survived. However, 65 people were injured, some extremely seriously. Rescuers weren't prepared for such a scale of disaster, so victims were transported even in tourist buses. The only fatality in this catastrophe was Clarabelle Lansing, who had worked as a flight attendant for 37 years. The cause of the disaster that claimed her life was essentially the aircraft's age. Rivets had worn out, fuselage parts were poorly connected, and metal had corroded. Perhaps the flight attendant's death could have been avoided, because it turned out that one passenger had noticed a crack above the cockpit before takeoff, but didn't report it.